In the final months of World War II, Allied soldiers were advancing across a collapsing Germany. They had seen destroyed rail lines, burned villages, abandoned barracks. They expected resistance. They expected chaos. They did not expect what waited behind those gates. When Soviet troops approached the outskirts of Lublin in July 1944, they believed they were entering another evacuated military facility. The German retreat had been fast. Equipment was left behind. Buildings stood quiet. There were no defensive positions, no last stand. But as the soldiers moved closer, something felt wrong. There was no sound, no shouting guards, no organized surrender, just stillness. Then the gates were opened. Inside there were prisoners, but not the kind soldiers were used to freeing. These men and women did not run forward cheering. Many did not move at all. Some stared blankly. Others were too weak to stand. They looked less like inmates of a prison and more like survivors of something far worse. The soldiers quickly realized they were not liberating a conventional camp. They were uncovering a system. Barracks stretched into the distance. Watchtowers stood over rows of wooden buildings. Fences lined with barbed wire cut across the landscape. And everywhere, signs that whatever had happened here was deliberate. This was Majdanek. It would be the first major concentration camp discovered almost completely intact, and what it revealed would change the war and the world forever. Because Majdanek was not an isolated crime. It was proof of something organized, something recorded, something industrial. And once those gates were opened, denial became impossible. Majdanek was not supposed to be seen. As Soviet troops moved through the camp in July 1944, they quickly realized the Germans had left in a hurry. Offices were still furnished. Documents were stacked inside cabinets. Storage buildings remained locked. And then they opened the warehouses. Inside were mountains of ordinary things. Shoes piled to the ceiling, children's coats folded in heaps, eyeglasses, cooking pots, suitcases with names written carefully in ink. Not scattered randomly, sorted, stored, cataloged. The soldiers began to understand that this was not a temporary prison camp abandoned during retreat. It was something methodical. The presence of records made that clear. Transport lists, prisoner numbers, work assignments, death counts. Everything had been written down. Majdanek had begun operating in late 1941. At first it held Soviet prisoners of war. Most of them died quickly from starvation, exposure, and disease. Over time, the camp expanded. Trains began arriving from across occupied Europe: Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia. Some prisoners were forced into labor. Others never left the reception area alive. The gas chambers were still standing when Soviet forces entered. The crematorium ovens were intact. Ash had been dumped in nearby fields. Execution trenches were visible in the earth. There had been no time to dismantle it. For the first time during the war, an entire Nazi killing center had been captured before it could be erased. News of Majdanek spread quickly. The Soviets documented everything: photographs, film, testimony. Even so, many outside the Eastern Front struggled to grasp the scale. The idea that an industrialized system of mass murder existed seemed unimaginable. But inside Germany, panic began to spread. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of the camp system, understood immediately what Majdanek meant. If advancing armies reached other camps intact, the evidence would be undeniable. Orders were sent out. Camps near the front were to be evacuated, records destroyed, buildings dismantled. Prisoners moved deeper into Germany. The objective was no longer victory, it was concealment. And so, as 1944 turned into 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced out of camps and driven westward on foot. They marched in winter conditions, with little food, little clothing, and no medical care. These evacuations would later be known as death marches. Majdanek had exposed the system. Now the regime was racing against time, not to save itself from defeat, but to hide what it had built. But there was one place far larger than Majdanek, and it could not be erased fast enough. By late 1944, the war was no longer about victory for Nazi Germany. It was about survival and concealment. Majdanek had shown what could happen if a camp was captured intact. The structures were still standing. The documents were still there. The proof was undeniable. That mistake would not be repeated. Orders moved quickly through the SS command structure. Camps close to advancing Allied forces were to be emptied. Prisoners were to be transported westward. Buildings were to be dismantled. Files burned. Graves dug up. Remains destroyed. But reality was moving faster than bureaucracy. As Soviet forces pushed through Poland and American and British troops advanced from the west, the evacuation of camps became chaotic. Trains were unavailable or bombed. Rail lines were damaged. Fuel was scarce, so prisoners were marched. Thousands at a time were forced onto roads in the middle of winter. They walked through snow and freezing wind, wearing thin camp uniforms, often barefoot or in worn shoes that fell apart after miles. There was little food, almost no rest. Those who collapsed slowed the column. Columns could not slow down. Guards were instructed to keep moving. Across forests, villages, and open fields, bodies began to mark the roads west. These marches were not random cruelty. They were part of the same system, an effort to relocate labor and eliminate witnesses before Allied forces could reach the camps. Meanwhile, inside Germany, camps that had once functioned as structured institutions began receiving waves of exhausted prisoners from the east. Overcrowding worsened. Food supplies ran out. Disease spread rapidly. Guards grew harsher as defeat became obvious. The system was cracking under its own weight. Gas chambers in some camps were dismantled. Crematoria were destroyed. Records were burned in furnaces meant for bodies. But scale is difficult to hide. You can burn paper. You can demolish buildings. You cannot erase tens of thousands of missing people. And there was one place at the center of it all, a complex so vast that dismantling it would take time the regime no longer had. By January 1945, Soviet troops were approaching southern Poland. Ahead of them stood Auschwitz. By January 1945, there was no longer time to dismantle everything. Auschwitz was not a single camp. It was a vast complex spread across miles of land near the town of Oświęcim in southern Poland. It included imprisonment blocks, forced labor sites, and Birkenau, the primary killing center. For nearly 5 years, trains had arrived here daily. As Soviet forces moved closer in late January, the SS began evacuating the camp. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced out in the freezing cold and marched west. Those too sick or too weak to walk were left behind. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army entered Auschwitz. They found about 7,000 prisoners still alive. Many were children. Some were twins who had been used in medical experiments. Others were teenagers who no longer resembled teenagers. Most were skeletal, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. When soldiers approached, some prisoners did not react. They had seen guards leave before. They did not know what liberation looked like. Barracks stood in rows across the frozen ground. Inside, wooden bunks were stacked 3 levels high. Blankets were thin. The air was heavy. Corpses still lay in some buildings, uncollected during the evacuation. But it was what stood beyond the barracks that forced a deeper realization. Birkenau. Gas chambers and crematoria had operated there for years. Some had been partially destroyed as the SS retreated, but the scale was still visible. Undressing rooms, sealed chambers, furnace structures built for continuous use. Then came the warehouses. Inside storage buildings, Soviet troops found mountains of possessions taken from prisoners upon arrival. More than 300,000 men's suits, hundreds of thousands of women's dresses, thousands of children's clothes, 7 tons of human hair had been stored in sacks. Eyeglasses filled crates. Prosthetic limbs were stacked against walls. Cooking utensils, prayer books, toothbrushes, suitcases labeled carefully with names and addresses. This was not chaos. It was cataloged. Everything had been sorted, processed, and prepared for redistribution. Auschwitz had not operated like a battlefield prison. It functioned like an industrial site. Trains arrived. Selections were made. Labor was assigned. Death was administered. Remains were processed. Over 1 million people were murdered here. The number is staggering, but what stunned soldiers most was not the statistic. It was the system, the infrastructure, the paperwork, the efficiency. This was not the work of a few rogue guards acting independently. It required coordination across rail networks, government offices, factories, and administrative departments. It required planning. The world had heard rumors for years, or reports of mass shootings, accounts from escapees, whispers of gas chambers. Auschwitz ended the argument. The evidence was physical, visible, measurable. Denial collapsed. And as news spread westward, Allied forces advancing through Germany began preparing for what they might find. Because Auschwitz was not the only camp, and some of the most shocking discoveries were still ahead, inside Germany itself. As Soviet troops exposed Auschwitz in the east, American and British forces were pushing into Germany from the west. Many soldiers still believed the worst of the camp system had been located in occupied territories, far from German cities, far from ordinary life. That assumption did not survive April 1945. On April 11th, American forces reached Buchenwald, near the city of Weimar. Unlike extermination centers built primarily for mass gassing, Buchenwald functioned as a concentration and forced labor camp. It had operated since 1937, inside Germany's own borders. When U.S. troops entered, they encountered survivors who were barely recognizable as human. Prisoners had secretly organized during the final days, disarming some remaining guards before liberation. But conditions inside were catastrophic. Barracks were overcrowded beyond capacity, food supplies had collapsed, disease had spread unchecked. Corpses lay stacked near buildings and along pathways. The smell carried beyond the perimeter fence. What shocked many soldiers most was proximity. Weimar was only a few miles away, a city associated with culture, literature, and German intellectual life. American authorities later ordered local civilians to walk through Buchenwald and witness the conditions firsthand. Some claimed they had no knowledge of what had occurred there. Others stood silent. The camp had existed for years. The evidence suggested it had not been invisible. 4 days later, on April 15th, British forces entered Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. There were no gas chambers at Bergen-Belsen. Killing had taken a different form. By the time British troops arrived, roughly 60,000 prisoners were still alive inside the camp. Another 13,000 bodies lay unburied across the grounds. Food had run out weeks earlier. Clean water systems had collapsed. Typhus and dysentery were spreading rapidly. Survivors were too weak to move. Many lay beside the dead. Medical teams worked immediately, but thousands died in the days following liberation. Their bodies had endured too much for too long. Then came Dachau. On April 29th, American forces reached the camp near Munich, the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime in 1933. What began as a detention center for political opponents had become the blueprint for a nationwide system. Outside the camp gates stood a train. Inside its freight cars were thousands of bodies transported from another camp. Many had died during the journey west as Germany collapsed. Within Dachau itself, prisoners were skeletal, disease was widespread, and crematorium structures stood intact. For some American soldiers, the shock and anger were immediate and overwhelming. Military investigations later examined incidents in which surrendered guards were shot in the chaos of liberation. The reaction reflected something larger than battlefield rage. These camps were not hidden in distant forests. They operated near cities, near factories, near communities. They required guards, administrators, suppliers, transportation networks. They required awareness. By the time Allied forces had crossed Germany, dozens of camps and hundreds of sub-camps had been uncovered. Some had been evacuated. Others were still functioning. Many were overwhelmed by overcrowding after the death marches from the east. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a collection of isolated prisons. It was a connected system. And the deeper investigators looked, the larger that system became. As Allied forces moved across Germany and Eastern Europe, camp after camp was uncovered. Some were massive complexes like Auschwitz. Others were smaller labor sites attached to factories, farms, quarries, and rail depots. Some were hidden in forests. Others stood near major cities. Many had existed for years without interruption. Investigators soon realized they were not dealing with dozens of camps. They were dealing with thousands. Historians later identified more than 44,000 sites connected to the Nazi detention and forced labor network, concentration camps, ghettos, transit camps, execution grounds, and satellite labor facilities spread across occupied Europe. Rail lines connected them. Paperwork documented them. Government ministries funded them. Private companies relied on their labor. Prisoners were registered, assigned numbers, tracked through transfers, and marked for work or death. Transport lists were typed and filed. Construction contracts were signed. Supplies were requisitioned. This was not spontaneous brutality carried out in secret corners. It was administrative, industrial, structured. Factories such as those producing weapons and machinery were built beside camps to maximize output. Prisoners were considered labor units. If they died, replacements arrived by train. The language of bureaucracy concealed the reality. Words like resettlement, special treatment, and evacuation appeared in documents. Behind those words were starvation, execution, and forced labor. By the spring of 1945, the regime that had designed this system was collapsing. But the infrastructure it left behind was undeniable. The camps were not accidents of war. They were the result of policy. And as evidence was collected, photographs developed, and testimonies recorded, it became clear that what had been uncovered was not just a series of crimes. It was a coordinated system of mass persecution and murder. The world would soon be forced to confront it in a courtroom. Good. This is where we land the plane. Steady, reflective, not preachy. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the physical liberation of the camps was only the beginning. Now came documentation. Military investigators, medical teams, and journalists moved through the sites collecting records, photographing structures, interviewing survivors. Graves were opened, transport lists were examined, administrative files were preserved. The scale was overwhelming. In November 1945, leading figures of the Nazi regime were brought before an international tribunal in Nuremberg. For the first time, government officials were charged not only with waging aggressive war, but with crimes against humanity. During the trials, film footage from liberated camps was shown in the courtroom. Gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses filled with belongings, emaciated survivors staring into the camera. The defendants watched. Some claimed they had been following orders. Others denied knowledge of the full scope of the killings. But the documents spoke clearly. The signatures were real. The directives were traceable. The system had left its own paper trail. The gates that had been opened in 1944 and 1945 did more than reveal suffering. They revealed what a modern state, equipped with railways, industry, bureaucracy, and ideology, was capable of building. The world could no longer say it did not know, and the phrase "never again" was born not from rumor or propaganda, but from evidence, discovered when soldiers forced open gates that were never meant to be opened. When Allied soldiers opened those gates, they were not just ending a war chapter, they were uncovering proof. Proof that modern systems, when driven by ideology and protected by silence, can normalize the unthinkable. The camps did not appear overnight. They expanded gradually. Laws changed, rights were removed, language shifted, neighbors disappeared, and the machinery kept moving. By the time the gates were forced open, millions were already gone. History remembers the images of liberation, but the harder question is what comes before that moment. What warning signs get ignored? What systems grow quietly? At what point does bureaucracy become something darker? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you value deep, human-centered historical storytelling like this, subscribe, because the stories that matter most are often the ones that require the most attention. I'll see you in the next one.